Hi, class. Today, what we're going to do is we're going to be looking at Chapter 2, and we're going to be working some problems calculating regular earnings, overtime earnings, and net pay. We're going to be also talking about some special things that will happen with the Fair Labor Standards Act. So if you'll just bear with me for just a second, I'm going to take you to an Excel spreadsheet that I've prepared for this class. All right, before we get started today, it's really important that you be aware of rounding rules in these problems. So if you've opened up your textbook and you're at the end of the chapter, what you're going to be doing in Cengage are the A problems for all of the chapters. Today, what I'm going to go through with you are B problems that are similar to the A problems. But before we can get started with those problems, you really need to understand about how Cengage has you rounding items for this course. So I want to make sure that you understand the rounding rules for each one of the chapters and what we're going to be using throughout the course, unless I would tell you otherwise. When you're calculating hourly rates and overtime rates, it'll be as follows. You want to carry the hourly rate and the overtime rate to 3 decimal places and then round off to 2 decimal places. You want to round the hourly rate to 2 decimal places before you multiply to get overtime, which is 1.5 times the overtime rate. So in other words, you're going to, when you're figuring your hourly rate, you're going to carry it out 3 decimal places. Then you're going to round it back 2 places. And then you take the hourly rate and you're going to multiply it by 1.5 to get the overtime rate. If the third decimal place is 5 or more, you're going to, of course, round to the next higher cent. But if the third decimal place is less than 5, you're going to simply drop to the third decimal place, or drop the third decimal place to where it has 2 decimal places. In other words, they've given you some examples here. The monthly rate is 1,827. If you were finding the weekly rate, you would take the 1,827 monthly rate, multiply it by 12 months in a year, and then divide it by 52 weeks in the year, and that will give you $421.615. That's 3 decimal places. So when we're talking about the rounding rules, since this 5 is 5 or more, we're going to round the 1 up to a 2. So $421.62 is the rounded weekly rate. To find the hourly rate, we would take the 421.62 cents for the weekly rate. We take the rounded one, in other words, and we're going to divide it by 40 regular hours. And that will give us a regular rate of $10.540. Since the 0 is less than 5, you're just going to make this $10.54. That's how they round. Then we'll take the hourly rounded amount, $10.54, and multiply it by 1.5 times, and that will give you the overtime rate. So be careful of your rounding rules, and I wanted to point this out to you, that it's very important that you understand this before you enter your answers in Cengage. Because if you don't follow the rounding rules, then your amounts will be wrong in Cengage. And so I don't want you to be frustrated with it. Just want to make sure that you know that these are the rules that they go by for rounding in the in this text. Also, you need to know some things about minimum wages, that there are certain exceptions to the minimum wage. And these certain conditions sometimes will allow us to pay less than the minimum wage rate to employees. You'll remember from chapter 1 that we said the Fair Labor Standards Act sets the minimum wage, and the minimum wage currently is 7.25, although in the news we're hearing that that's going to change at some point in time this year. But right now we're using 7.25 as the current amount of minimum wage rate. But under certain conditions, our companies can pay less than minimum wage rate to some employees. So it's important that you know that if you are a tipped employee, or if you are employing tipped employees, that you can pay them less than the minimum wage rate. And we're going to talk about that today when we actually do a problem with a tipped employee. You also, if you are allowed to pay a training wage, that will allow employers to pay $4.25 per hour to newly hired employees under the age of 20 years. This is called an opportunity wage. And this only applies to the first 90 consecutive calendar days of employment. So if you're training an employee who is under 20 years of age, you can pay them less than the minimum wage rate for the first 90 days of employment. Also, if you're a retail employer, or you run a service establishment or a farm, you can also employ full-time students at 85% of the minimum wage. And so if you took 85% and you multiplied it by $7.25, this is what it would give you. But notice what happens here. This is something that I just have to point out to you. I don't quite understand it, but our government rounds to $6.17 in favor of the employee. So if you are a full-time student and you work for retail, a service type of business, or a farm, it is legal for the employer to pay you less than a minimum wage amount. But that amount should be at least $6.17. Also, if you are an institution of higher learning, such as the college, you may employ your own full-time students at 85% of the minimum wage. So if you are a student and you're working for the college, they can pay you less than the minimum wage rate of $7.25. They can pay you 85% of that minimum wage rate. Also, student learners may be employed at 75% of the minimum wage if they are participating in a bona fide vocational training program that is conducted by an accredited school. So if you are a student learner and you're doing a vocational program, and the school wants to pay you $5.44 rather than $7.25, it is legal for them to do that. Firms whose principal business is the delivery of letters and messages may employ messengers at not less than 95% of the minimum wage. This is another exception to the minimum wage rule. And persons whose earning capacity is impaired by age, physical or mental deficiency, or injury can also be employed at a special minimum wage rate. However, a certificate authorizing employment at such rates must first be obtained from the Department of Labor's Wage and Hour Division. So what we need to know is that the minimum hourly wage rate right now that is set by our government is $7.25. But there are some situations where employers can pay less than the minimum wage. And these are the conditions where that could happen. So make sure you know your rounding rules and make sure you understand that some employers can pay less than minimum wage based on these rules here. I'm going to move now to our first problem. And again, we're working in chapter 2, and this is going to be problem 1B. Our problem states Jenna Cross is a full-time student at Kirby University. So remember, if it's a university, they don't have to pay Jenna $7.25. They can pay her less. She has been employed by the boot shop as a salesperson for over 4 months. Her hourly rate is $5.25. And 1 week she worked 33 hours and 33 and a fourth hours. And they want you to round to the nearest cent. So what's happening is this employer is paying the employee $5.25. We're going to multiply that by the number of hours worked. Notice it's less than 40, so we don't have to pay any overtime to this particular employee. So the overtime hours are 33 hours and 0.25, or 33.25 is equal to 33 and a fourth hours. If you multiply 525 times 33.25, it will give you total earnings of $174.5625. Remember our rounding rules. You take it out 3 places, and if the third decimal place is more than 5, you'll round it up. But since the third decimal place is a 2, which is less than 5, we keep it at $174.56. Now, this is what the Kirby University is paying the student, is $5.25 an hour. And the next part of this they want to know, is that in violation of the Fair Labor Standards Act? And the answer is yes, the hourly rate is in violation of the Fair Labor Standards Act. Remember that full-time students can be employed in retail or service industries at 85% of the minimum wage. If you took 85% of $7.25, that would give you 6.17 rounded by the government. That's one of the rules that we talked about in our instructions. So if you want to refer back to your instructions, you can. I'm going to post these Excel spreadsheets for you to look at too, and have these to go along with the videotapes that I'm providing for you. So if the hourly rate is in violation of the Fair Labor Standards Act, which we said that it was, because they're paying them $5.25 an hour, and they should have been paying them $6.17 per hour. What is the amount the boot shop should pay Cross for the week? And then it has out to the side, when computing the hourly per hour rate, use the government's rounding rules in your calculation. And remember, the hourly rate is in violation of the Fair Labor Standards Act because the amount that they were paying was $5.25, and they should have paid $6.17. So $6.17, which is 85% of the minimum wage, times the number of hours worked will give you total earnings of $205.152, which was really a 3, which is less than 5, which means that our rounding would still stay at $205.15. So they should be paying the employee $205.15, not the amount that they were paying in the first part of this problem. So I'm going to move to the second problem that I want to talk to you about today. And this one is working with a restaurant. Bert Garrow is a waiter at the LeBron House, where he receives a weekly wage of $75 plus tips for a 40-hour work week. Garrow's weekly tips range from $300 to $350. So this is a tipped employee, and his weekly tips are from $300 to $350. So some restaurants choose to pay their employees for less than the minimum wage rate, as long as there is enough tips to bring their total wages to at least the minimum wage amount. So if you're paying a tipped employee, there's an exception to the Fair Labor Standards Act. And what they want you to do is they want you to figure out what the minimum amount of wages that Garrow must receive for a 40-hour work week is. So what we're going to do is we're going to take the minimum cash wage rate for a tipped employee. That minimum cash wage rate for a tipped employee is $2.13. We're going to multiply that by our regular hours, because he was working 40 hours. He's not going to be paid any overtime. So $2.13 times 40 hours is $85.20. That's the minimum amount that he should have been paid. Notice in this problem that the employer was paying him $75 plus tips. So they are in violation of the Fair Labor Standards rule. I want to note, however, that when we're talking about employers that are paying tipped employees, that the employers can pay the tipped employees less than the federal minimum wage rate of $7.25, as long as the employee has enough tips to bring their total wages to the minimum wage earnings amount of $77.25 for 40 hours. In other words, the tips plus what the employer pays should amount to at least $290, which is $7.25 times 40 hours. It's the minimum wage times 40 hours. All employees need to be paid at least $290. The amount employers may pay is $2.13 for 40 hours. This is according to the Fair Labor Standards Law. If you're paying a tipped employee, you can pay them $2.13 per hour for 40 hours, which would amount to $85.20, like we calculated earlier. Employers of tipped employees are allowed a credit of $5.12 per hour. In other words, the minimum wage is $7.25, but the employer can pay an employee, a tipped employee, $2.13. So the employer is getting a credit of $5.12, or a total credit for 40 hours at $204.80. In the B part of this problem, it says since the LeBron House is in violation of the Fair Labor Standards Law, remember they have to pay at least $85.20 to their tipped employee. They were not doing that. They were just paying $75. So since LeBron House is in violation of the Fair Labor Standards Act, the employer is only paying Bert $75. That should say paying there. So the employer only paid Bert $75, and that's okay. Not the amount that should have been paid, which is $85.20. The additional amount it should pay Garrow each week to meet the minimum wage requirement for a tipped employee is what amount? And so the minimum wage for a tipped employee is $2.13 for 40 hours. If you multiply $2.13 by 40 hours, it gives you $85.20. That's the minimum amount the employer must pay a tipped employee. The wages that were actually paid to this employee was $75. So the difference between these two is the additional amount of wages that they needed to meet the Fair Labor Standards requirement. So the employer should have paid $85.20. They only paid $75, so they still owe this employee $10.20 plus their tips. And so that's all I want to say about problem 2B. We're going to move on to problem 3B. And in this problem, what they're wanting you to do is to figure out what we call gross earnings. The gross earnings are found by multiplying the regular hourly wage rate times the number of hours worked. As long as the number of hours worked is under 40 hours, we don't have to pay any overtime to this employee. So the gross earnings are the earnings that we would owe the employee before we've taken out any deductions for that employee for taxes or insurance or whatever the deductions might be for that employee. In this problem, what they want you to do is just to compute the gross earnings for each one of these employees. For Duffy, Hazelton, Inman, Palmer, and Diaz. And then they want you to calculate the total gross earnings in B, which is a combination of all of these combined together. So you're simply multiplying here. 35 hours times the regular hourly wage rate of $11.90 is a gross earnings of $416.50. 28 hours for Hazelton times his wage rate or her wage rate, not sure which one this is, at $14.15 will give you total gross earnings of $396.20. So what we're doing is we're simply multiplying our hours worked times our regular hourly wage to get the gross earnings. The gross earnings are the earnings before any deductions have been taken out. Now, this could have also been called the regular gross earnings because there's no overtime that we're paying to any of these employees. They didn't work over 40 hours, so we don't owe them anything for overtime. So to find the total gross earnings for all of the employees added together is $2,044.95. So that's all I want to say about this particular problem. In the next problem, what they're doing is something similar to the previous problem, but we're going to calculate the regular earnings And we're going to also have to calculate the overtime rate and the overtime earnings, so that when we combine the regular earnings with the overtime earnings, it will give us the total gross earnings before any deductions have been taken out. So this is a really short form of a payroll register that we talked about in the last chapter. Remember, a payroll register is just the amount that we're paying employees for a period of time. These are all of our employees, and these are the hours worked. Now notice these hours worked are over 40 hours. So there's going to be some overtime that we have to pay to the employees for hours worked over 40 hours. In the first example for Wilson, his regular hourly wage rate was $11.90. To find the regular earnings, we would multiply $11.90 times 40 hours, because that would be his regular earnings pay here. So if you notice, there's a formula here in this Excel spreadsheet. So if you get lost and you don't know how the calculations were made, you can look up here and it will review you on what happened. So it took 40 hours, because the regular hours would be 40 for each one of these employees, and I multiply it by the regular hourly rate, and that will give you the regular earnings for each one of these employees. So 40 times $14.20 will give you regular earnings of this. 40 times $13.90 will give you regular earnings of this. 40 times $10.70 will give you total regular earnings of this. And 40 hours times 17.1 or $17.10 will give you 684. Each one of the regular hourly wage rates is multiplied by 40 regular hours. Then I simply added all these together to get the total regular earnings, which they did not ask you to do, but this gives you a systems of checks and balances that you're going to see in just a minute. What you had to figure out is the overtime earnings rate. And to find the overtime earnings rate, we take the regular hourly wage rate and we multiply it by 1.5 or 1.5 times. So 1.5 times $11.90 is $17.85. That's the overtime rate that we would be charging, or we would be paying to Wilson. To find the overtime rate for AHA, we're going to take the regular rate of $14.20 and we're going to multiply it by 1.5 times. $21.30 is the amount of the overtime rate for AHA. For SHOP is $13.90 times 1.5 or 1.5 times will give you $20.85. 10.70 times 1.5 is the overtime rate of $16.05. 1710 times 1.5 gives you the overtime rate for McMurray. Once you have the overtime rate, then you multiply it by the overtime hours. For Wilson, the total hours were 43 hours. He had 3 hours overtime. Regular earnings are based on 40 hours. Overtime earnings are based on any amount above 40 hours. So he had 3 hours of overtime. So we take the overtime rate and multiply it by 3 hours. So there were 3 overtime hours times the overtime rate that we had calculated, and that will give you the overtime earnings of $53.55 for Wilson. We do the same thing for the remainder of these. Take the overtime rate and multiply it by the number of overtime hours. For AHA, the overtime hours were 2. For Shoop, the overtime hours are 7. 7 times the overtime rate will give you the overtime earnings for Shoop. And for Carolyn, there are 1.5 hours in overtime. So 1.5 hours in overtime times the overtime rate of $16.05 will give you $24.08. 5 hours in overtime times $25.65 gives you $128.25. To find the total gross earnings, we will add the regular earnings plus the overtime earnings together. These are the gross earnings before any deductions have been taken out. So the total gross earnings for Wilson is the regular earnings plus the overtime earnings. The same is true for the remainder of these. The regular earnings plus the overtime earnings is the total earnings. When you combine all employees together, the total amount of the gross earnings, or Part B answer, is $3,106.43. So what you have to remember about this problem is you're going to have to calculate your overtime rate and your overtime earnings, as well as your regular earnings. Regular earnings plus overtime earnings are equal to the total gross earnings amount. In the next problem, problem 5B, and this is going to be the last problem for this video, we're going to calculate the earnings for a waiter. The Hunter Sobston is a waiter at the 20th Hole restaurant, and he worked 43.5 hours. So he's got some overtime hours that we need to be able to calculate. He worked 43.5 hours this week and collected over $650 in tips. So he's a tipped employee, and the restaurant does not have to pay $7.25 as minimum wage. If you'll remember, what we talked about earlier is that the minimum wage rate for a tipped employee is $2.13. The restaurant is using the full tip credit against the minimum wage, and they're going to pay trying to move this out of the way so I can see what I'm reading. Y'all probably can't see that, but I can. So I had to move something out of the way. But anyway, the restaurant uses the full tip credit against the minimum wage and pays Sobitson the minimum required for tipped employees. So the regular pay would be for 40 hours. The minimum wage rate that this employer can pay, because this is a tipped employee, is $2.13 times 40. In other words, the employer has to pay $85.20 to the employee, who is Hunter. The main thing that they wanted to emphasize in this problem is how you calculate pay for overtime hours for a tipped employee. What we would do is we would calculate the overtime rate as being the minimum wage of $7.25 times 1.5 times the overtime rate is $10.88. But since this is a tipped employee, the minimum wage less the minimum rate paid for the tipped employee would equal the tip credit that would be given to the employer. So minimum wage is $7.25. The employer has to pay $2.13. So they have a tipped credit of $5.12 that they don't have to pay. You will subtract the tip credit from the overtime pay rate, and the only amount of overtime that this employer has to pay is $5.76. That's the overtime rate for the tipped employee. The number of overtime hours was 3.5 hours times the overtime rate that we just calculated for a tipped employee, which is $5.76, will give you total earnings, overtime earnings of $20.16. So this employer would have to pay regular earnings of $85.20, overtime earnings of $20.16, plus the employee would get their tips. So these two combined plus the tips would be the total amount of wages that the employee earned. And so that's all I want to talk to you about today. I think 5 problems at a time is enough. And so I want you to let this absorb and make sure you pay attention to your instructions for rounding rules, and make sure that you know the exceptions to the federal FLSA, the federal standard federal labor act, which is the sets the minimum wage. You need to know the exceptions for that, which are in this spreadsheet under instructions. And so I'm going to stop here, and we'll see you next time. Bye bye.